Strange article just came out in the Washington Post that looks like it was paid for by the Somalian artificial government. It's pretty clear that Somalia's leadership, having failed to get any attention from the Trump administration, after it hired one of the top lobbying firms in the U.S. to fight back against the new administration. Somalia's government is trying to grab attention by making threats after failing to get through to President Trump, decided to go to the Washington Post. The article itself sounds like a pre-written canned. Reads like a bizarre mix of begging, threats, and historical distortions. But what stands out most are the lies surrounding the issue that's clearly eating at the core of the Somalian government. The re-recognition of the Republic of Somaliland and American taxpayers' money coming to an end. It is nothing more than a mix of pleading for more foreign aid and using fear tactics about terrorism to keep the money coming in. Somalia has been a failed entity for years, and this is just their latest attempt to hold on to whatever they can. Now let's first discuss how the Somalian president didn't just lie, he strategically weaponized the moment to push his perfectly crafted narrative and blackmail the U.S. He knew global attention was elsewhere, so he took his shot. If you recognize Somaliland, Africa's borders will collapse, and secessionist movements will rise. Classic fear-mongering, but completely baseless. Hassan Sheikh's entire argument was built on a fundamental lie, that Somaliland is a breakaway or secessionist entity. That's not just false, it's an outright reversal of reality. Somaliland is the de jure, legally recognized country that existed before Somalia even gained independence. You can't secede from something you were never legally part of. The so-called Union in 1960? Never ratified. No treaty. No legal basis. Nothing. And let's be real, this isn't about protecting Africa's borders. It's about Somalia's survival. Without Somaliland's stolen credentials propping it up, Somalia's entire claim to statehood crumbles. That's why this unelected, hand-picked leader of a government that barely controls 2 kilometers of Mogadishu is so desperate to keep up the lie. This was not just misinformation, it was deliberate political blackmail to stop the U.S. from correcting a historical and legal fact: Somaliland is not Somalia. Never was. Never will be. He's exploiting the U.S. at a time when an entirely separate conflict, the DRC-Rwanda dispute, is unfolding. Seeing the perfect moment, he jumped in with C. This is what will happen in Africa if Somaliland is recognized. It's a blatant scare tactic, meant to manipulate the U.S. into overlooking legal facts and forcing Republic of Somaliland to remain in a non-existent, fraudulent political annexation under a false premise of an illegal union that was never legally established. The Somalian unelected provisional president's entire argument is built on deliberate lies and omissions. Starting with 1960. He claimed Somalia is one and mentioned 1960, but conveniently left out that there are 2 key dates that year. June 26, 1960, the Republic of Somaliland became independent from Britain and was internationally recognized as a sovereign de jure country with defined borders. July 1, 1960, the Italian non-state Somalia was still under trusteeship and looked for independence only when it attempted its annexation of Somaliland, and falsely claimed it was a union, but that union was never ratified or legalized. So why did he omit June 26? Because admitting it means acknowledging that Somaliland is already an independent country before Somalia even existed. And here's the trick. He kept calling Republic of Somaliland British Somaliland instead of just Somaliland, although Somaliland was an independent country. Why? Because admitting it as Somaliland means acknowledging it was already sovereign and independent before Somalia's so-called union ever happened. This matters because when Somaliland became independent on June 26, 1960, it was already recognized with its own borders, which align with the 1964 African Union Resolution to respect colonial-era boundaries. That destroys his argument that Somaliland's re-recognition by the U.S. or any other country would change borders in Africa. Republic of Somaliland's borders are defined, demarcated, and have been the same since 1960. Nothing needs to change. So let's be clear, failed Somalia is one entity, and Somaliland is another country. They were never one. The Somalian unelected president knows this, which is why he keeps pushing the false term British Somaliland to avoid admitting that Somalia illegally annexed an already independent country. As I explained on my latest article, Somalia is not a country. Why does it even exist? The worst part? International media isn't fact-checking any of this. They're blindly publishing these lies, normalizing annexation, and letting failed Somalia rewrite history to keep Somaliland trapped in a fake, illegal union that never existed in the first place. Let's not ignore how he tried to minimize Somaliland's diplomatic journey, the journey that only became necessary after Somalia committed genocide against Somaliland's people. A genocide Somalia has never been held accountable for. In fact, this same Somalian president is harboring and protecting the very perpetrators of that genocide. And now, he's sponsoring a militia in Eastern Republic of Somaliland to create chaos, trying to dismantle Somaliland's democracy and peace, the very things that make Somaliland a strong, self-sustaining state. Why? So he can turn around and tell the West, just like he did today, it's not worth it to acknowledge Somaliland? This individual is not an elected leader. He's a tribal figurehead, handpicked by a small group of clan leaders under 4.5 clan system in failed Somalia. He controls nothing, not even 2 kilometers of Mogadishu, and yet, he's out here trying to dictate Somaliland's fate. His entire artificial government exists under the protection of foreign troops, whether it's African Union forces or U.S. military backing. Because his own people have spent decades turning to terrorism. And what does Somalia contribute to the world? Piracy, terrorism, famine, and an obsession with annexation. Billions of American and European taxpayer dollars have been poured into Somalia, funding his lavish non-stop global travel while his people are either starving or dying in terrorist attacks. This man has no business lecturing the world on what Somaliland deserves. Somalia is ranked the #1 most corrupt entity in the world and the most fragile. Every global index and report for the past 30 years has confirmed this. A so-called government that has spent decades at the bottom of every stability and governance ranking wants to lecture the world on statehood? A non-state entity, surviving on foreign aid and military protection, has no legitimacy to speak on Somaliland, an actual functioning country with legal sovereignty dates back to June 26, 1960. This so-called fight against Al-Shabaab is a complete joke. The reality? This tribal leader doesn't fight Al-Shabaab, he hires them. His defense minister is an ex-Al-Shabaab member, his foreign minister has direct ties to them. And security reports have exposed how he used to pay Al-Shabaab to eliminate his political opponents. His religious affairs minister is actually a co-founder of Al-Shabaab. There's even a video of Hassan Sheikh Mohammed himself admitting that he works with Al-Shabaab and hires them into his so-called government. So how can you defeat the people you're actively working with? Simple, you can't. His government is Al-Shabaab, and Al-Shabaab is his government. They're two faces of the same coin, and let's be real, this is a business. Somalia thrives on instability because it's the only way it keeps foreign aid flowing. Without terrorism, piracy, and war, Somalia has nothing to offer the world. This is how they blackmail the West into pouring in billions of dollars, because without the constant cycle of insecurity, there's no money to be made. Somalia's war economy is profitable to them and to everyone involved, including the foreign forces stationed there. Somalia just panicking now that the new Trump administration is done entertaining the facade. The free ride is over, and they know it. That's why Somalia's government ran to one of the biggest American outlets to pay for propagandist article, hoping to keep the money flowing. It's nothing but a desperate attempt to beg for aid, using scare tactics and fake narratives to manipulate the U.S. into continuing to bankroll his failed, terrorist-infested non-state entity. Somalia wants money, and he has absolutely no shame in running to the media to tell the American public, screw your America First agenda. If you don't pay him, he's essentially saying, it's your fault my country is a failed entity. His entire strategy is to put the blame on the West and twist it into a scare tactic. He calls it fighting terrorism, but it's nothing more than a profitable business for Somalian warlords, his fake government, and the terrorists they work with. Somalia even had the audacity to threaten the Americans, if you don't pay, you'll be dealing with suicide bombers in London and New York. Al-Shabaab is a threat to you, so roll up your sleeves and cash me out. The audacity. Somalia is holding the world hostage, extorting the West to fund its failed, corrupt, and terrorist-infested regime. One thing he conveniently brought up was the Houthis, but the reality is his artificial government has deep ties with them. In fact, his regime and tribal leaders in regions like Puntland have facilitated millions of dollars buying weapons from the Houthis, all with the aim of attacking Somaliland. So, it's utterly laughable to hear him claim that the Houthis and Al-Shabaab are working together. All while conveniently hiding the fact that he's been actively working with both the Houthis and Al-Shabaab himself, alongside the other tribal leaders in his failing entity. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's an active betrayal of the countries that are paying for Somalia's security and war on terror. Playing a dangerous game with international terrorists while hiding behind a false narrative. This absolute joke of a leader actually had the audacity to say that the Trump administration and the Americans based their views of Somalia on TV movies. As if the U.S. government is sitting around, binge-watching Netflix documentaries on Somalia, and making foreign policy decisions based on Hollywood's take on the place. As if Somalia isn't the most failed entity on the planet, with billions of dollars flushed down the toilet for decades. Somalia isn't a place of progress, it's a war-torn, terrorist-filled nightmare that's been cashing in on global pity for way too long. And yet, this guy wants to make it seem like the Trump administration is the real villain, living in some made-up fantasy world. Hilarious. How many millions of dollars has he pocketed while his people starve and die under the chaos the tribal warlords and his artificial government orchestrating? This is the country holding the world hostage with his failed state, and yet he's the one lecturing others about what's real. The shamelessness is off the charts. What a clown show.